In the autumn of 1874, on the wind-scraped plains outside Merrow Creek, Texas, a woman named Clara Whitfield stepped down from a stagecoach with a single trunk, a black wool coat, and nothing else the world could see. The man waiting for her, Josiah Colton, 31 years old, a widower with 200 acres of drought-cracked land and $11 to his name, had paid a marriage agency for a bride he believed to be as penniless as himself. He did not know about the folded deed sewn into the lining of her trunk, nor the notebook of her late father's mineral surveys pressed flat beneath her spare petticoats. Clara Whitfield had been sent away by her own family to disappear quietly. She had come instead to build something that would outlast every one of them. If you're watching this from somewhere far from Texas tonight, drop your city in the comments, and if you like a slow-built story of a woman nobody saw coming, stay till the end. Josiah Colton had not wanted a wife. He had wanted a woman who could keep a house standing, watch a boy who was still afraid of thunder 2 years after his mother died of scarlet fever, and ask for nothing beyond bread and a roof. The marriage agency in Fort Worth had promised him a widow of modest means named Clara Whitfield, 22 years old, of Millhaven, Georgia, orphaned by her father's death the previous spring, willing to relocate for a fair and practical arrangement. The letter that came back in her own hand had been short, plainly written, without a single flourish or complaint. He had liked that about it. He liked it less when the coach pulled up outside the Mercantile in Merrow Creek, and the woman who stepped down looked at the town, and at him, and at the boy standing half behind his father's leg, with an expression of such contained, unhurried assessment that Josiah felt for a moment as though he were the one being interviewed. "Mr. Colton," she said, and it was not a question. "Ms. Whitfield." He touched his hat. "This is Daniel." Clara crouched, not quickly, not with the exaggerated softness some adults performed for children they did not know how to speak to, but slowly, so the boy could watch her come down to his eye level without alarm. "Daniel," she said, "I have peppermint in my trunk. I don't know yet if you like peppermint, but I intend to find out." Daniel did not answer, but he did not retreat further behind his father's leg either, and Josiah counted that as a fair beginning. The ride out to the Colton Ranch took the better part of an hour, the wagon jolting over a road rutted by a summer with almost no rain. Clara sat with her hands folded over her trunk, taking in the land with the same unhurried attention she had given the town, the cracked clay of the creek bed, the cattle standing thin-flanked in the shade of what mesquite trees had survived the drought, the house itself when it came into view, a low-frame structure with a sagging porch roof and a chimney that leaned a half-degree off true. "The well's low," Josiah said, before she could ask, because he had decided he would rather say it himself than have her discover it and think less of him for the silence. "Has been since July. We're hauling water from the Merrick place twice a week." "How far is the Merrick place?" 4 miles. Clara nodded once, filing the fact away, the way she filed most things, without visible reaction. "And the banknote Mrs. Pruitt mentioned in her letter to the agency, is that still outstanding?" Josiah's jaw tightened. He had not authorized the agency to discuss his finances, and he said so. "They didn't discuss anything," Clara said. "I asked what kind of man I was marrying, and a marriage agency that wants repeat business tells a woman enough truth to keep her from feeling cheated later. $1,200 to First Bank of Merrow Creek, is that right?" $1,180, Josiah said, because there was no use pretending otherwise now, and something about the flat, unbothered way she'd said the number made lying feel not just useless, but faintly ridiculous. "Due in full or renegotiated by next November." "Then we have 13 months, Clara said, as though this were a manageable fact rather than a looming catastrophe, and turned back to the window to watch the land go by. They were married 2 days later by the circuit preacher, in the front room of the house, with Daniel standing between them holding a jar of goldenrod he had picked himself, and Hannah Merrick, the widow who owned the ranch 4 miles east and had known Josiah's late wife well enough to grieve her properly, standing as the only witness besides the preacher's wife. It was not a wedding with music or a wedding dress. only a clean gray traveling dress Clara had brought for the purpose, and a ring that had belonged to Josiah's grandmother, too big for her finger, until Hannah produced a scrap of string to wind beneath the band. Nobody cried at all that day. Nobody expected anyone to, and nobody was particularly surprised when nobody did. That night, after Daniel had been put to bed and the dishes from a supper of cornbread and beans had been washed and set to dry, Clara unpacked her trunk in the small back room that would be hers. She did it without hurry, and without an audience, laying her few dresses in the chest at the foot of the bed, setting a hairbrush and a small tin of pins on the washstand, and finally lifting out the false bottom she had built into the trunk herself, back in Millhaven, using a hand plane borrowed from her father's old workshop, and 3 nights of careful, silent labor, while her uncle believed her to be asleep. Beneath it lay a leather notebook, its cover soft with handling, and a folded document sealed with wax that had never been broken. She did not open either one that night. She only set her palm flat against the notebook's cover for a moment, the way another woman might have touched a photograph, and then she put both items back beneath the false bottom, closed the trunk, and went to sleep in a house that was not yet hers in any way but law. She had told Josiah Colton the truth about her name, her age, and the fact of her father's death. She had not told him that her father, Edwin Whitfield, had spent 18 years as a mineral surveyor for railroad and mining concerns across 3 states before a fever took him in the spring of 1873, or that the notebook in her trunk held the last 2 years of his fieldwork, written in a private shorthand only the 2 of them had ever fully understood, because Clara had ridden beside him on more than one of those surveys herself, holding the chain, reading the level, learning to read strata and seep lines, and the particular color of soil above a hidden water table, the way other girls her age had learned embroidery. She had not told him that her father's brother, Rufus Whitfield, had gone through the estate within a week of the funeral and declared that nothing of value remained beyond debts, and that Rufus had then arranged, with a speed that still turned something cold in Clara's stomach when she thought of it, for her removal from the household by way of a mail-order marriage agency, collecting a placement fee for the trouble, and telling the extended family that Clara had chosen, of her own free will, to seek a fresh start out west. She had not told Josiah about the sealed document, a deed her father had recorded 11 months before his death, granting Clara Whitfield sole and separate title, not community property, not subject to her uncle's guardianship, a fact Edwin Whitfield had been careful and lawyerly enough to specify, to 160 acres of land in the Sacramento foothills of New Mexico Territory, land her father had surveyed himself and quietly purchased for $80 from a rancher who thought it worthless scrub, because Edwin Whitfield's field notes suggested otherwise. She had told Josiah Colton none of this because she had learned, at 22, that a woman's advantages disclosed too early were simply advantages other people found ways to take from her. She intended to wait. She did not yet know for what, exactly, only that a still, watchful patience had served her better than speech, every single time her family had underestimated her, and she saw no reason to abandon the habit now that she had arrived somewhere new. What she had not accounted for, in those first quiet days, was how much watching this particular household would require, and how quickly she would come to care about the outcome of it. The first weeks fell into a rhythm dictated by the drought. Josiah rose before light to check the cattle and ride the fence line for breaks, and Clara rose not long after to build up the stove, start the coffee, and set out the morning's cornbread before Daniel woke rubbing his eyes in the doorway. She had not been raised to cook. Her mother had died when she was 9, and the Whitfield household in Millhaven had kept a cook and 2 housegirls until the year everything fell apart. But she had watched enough and asked enough plain questions of Hannah Merrick, who rode over twice that first week under the pretense of borrowing thread, and stayed both times to show Clara how to keep a wood stove from scorching biscuits, that by the second week her cornbread came out level and her coffee no longer tasted of scalded grounds. What she could not disguise, because she did not try to, was the way she looked at things. On the fourth morning, walking the dry bed of the creek that cut along the eastern edge of the Colton land to see how far the water had retreated, she stopped at a stretch where the clay had cracked into hexagonal plates and crouched to press her palm flat against the ground. "Something wrong with it?" Josiah asked. He had come looking for her because breakfast was cold and Daniel was hungry, and found her a quarter-mile from the house, studying dirt as though it owed her an explanation. "The clay here is a different color than upstream," Clara said, "grayer. And there's a line of willow scrub along this bank that doesn't grow the other side, even though the ground looks the same to the eye. Willows grow where willows grow," Josiah said, not unkindly, but with the particular patience of a man who had farmed the same land his whole life and had never found much use for guesswork. "They grow where there's water within reach of their roots," Clara said, "even when the surface is dry." She straightened, brushing clay from her palm, and did not say anything further, because she had learned that men who had worked land for years did not care to be told about it by a woman married to them for 11 days. She filed the willow line away in her memory beside the notebook in her trunk and said only, "Breakfast is cold. I'm sorry, I lost track of the hour." It was a small thing, easily forgotten by anyone who was not paying close attention. Josiah was not, that morning, paying close attention. He was thinking about the note at First Bank and the thinness of his herd. But Daniel, walking a few paces behind them, tugging at a stem of dead grass, remembered it, the way children remember odd things adults say and forget to explain, and 3 weeks later, when he was digging with a stick near that same bend of the creek out of pure boredom, he would bring Clara a fistful of dark, damp earth from 6 inches down and ask her, with perfect 6-year-old seriousness, whether that meant the willows were right. By the end of the first month, the household had absorbed Clara into its rhythms in a way that surprised Josiah more than he let himself examine too closely. She did not fill silences with talk the way his late wife Mary had, God rest her, who had hummed while she worked and filled every quiet room with some small noise of her own making. Clara worked in a stillness that Josiah found, against his expectations, restful rather than cold. She mended what needed mending without being asked. She took over the household ledger in the second week, not out of any stated ambition, but because she had found it wedged behind a flour tin, half-finished and badly balanced, and had corrected 3 arithmetic errors before supper without comment, sliding it back onto the shelf as though she had done nothing more than straighten a crooked picture frame. Josiah found the corrected ledger 2 days later, when he went looking for the receipt from the feed store. He sat with it a long while at the kitchen table after Clara had gone to bed, running his finger down the neat new columns, the numbers added in a small, upright hand entirely unlike his own cramped scrawl, and understood for the first time that his wife could do arithmetic in her head faster than he could do it with a pencil. He did not say anything about it the next morning, but he set the ledger on the shelf where she could reach it easily, rather than behind the flour tin, and that was, in its way, the first thing Josiah Colton ever gave Clara Whitfield that she had not had to ask for. Hannah Merrick became, in those early weeks, the closest thing Clara had to a friend in Marrow Creek, though neither woman would have used that word so soon. Hannah was 36, widowed 4 years, running 300 acres with the help of 2 hired men, and a stubbornness the whole county had opinions about. She rode over on the pretext of errands, often enough that by the second month it had stopped needing a pretext at all, and she was direct in a way Clara found, after a childhood spent parsing her stepmother's careful indirections, almost a relief. "You're not what I expected," Hannah told her, the 5th or 6th time she came by, sitting at the kitchen table while Clara shelled dried beans into a pot. "What did you expect? Some sad, worn-down thing off the mail-order coach, grateful for a roof and too tired to have opinions." Hannah took a handful of beans and began shelling alongside her without being asked. "You've got opinions, you just don't spend them cheap." Clara considered this. My father used to say that a woman who says everything she thinks has already given away everything she has to trade. Your father sounds like he was either very wise or very hard to live with. Both, Clara said, and something in her voice. Not quite grief, not quite fondness, but close to both, made Hannah look up from the beans and decide, without needing to be told, not to ask further that day. It was Hannah who first mentioned Cyrus Colton's name to Clara in any detail, though only in passing, the way one mentions weather that is expected to turn bad eventually. Josiah's brother will come around before winter, she said. He always does when the note's coming due. Cyrus thinks their father meant to leave him the home section, and Josiah got it instead on account of being the younger and their mother's favorite, and he's spent 12 years finding new ways to say so without saying it outright. She glanced toward the door, though there was no one to overhear. He's not a cruel man, exactly. He's a man who's decided the world owes him something, and never stopped being surprised it hasn't paid up. Clara filed this away too, the way she filed the willow line and the gray clay, without visible reaction, though she noted the particular tightness that came into her own shoulders at the mention of a relative who believed himself owed. It was a tightness she recognized from her Uncle Rufus, and she did not think that recognition would serve her poorly. The hired man arrived in late September, on foot, leading a lame horse, and asked Josiah for work in exchange for a place to sleep in the barn and whatever wages the ranch could spare once the cattle sold. His name was Tobias Reyes, somewhere past 40, though it was hard to say exactly, with the sun-cured, weathered look of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors and the quiet, economical movements of someone who had learned early that unnecessary motion wasted energy a body might need later. He had drifted through half of Texas doing ranch work, breaking horses, and, Clara noticed within the first week, watching him repair a section of fence with tools clearly older and better cared for than anything else in the barn. Tracking, the kind of tracking that came from years spent reading ground the way other men read newspapers. "You favor your left leg," Clara said to him one morning, not unkindly, watching him carry a feed sack across the yard. "Old wound," Tobias said, "doesn't slow me down." "I didn't say it did." She held his gaze a moment, the same unhurried assessment she had given Josiah and the town on her first day, and something passed between them that was not quite trust yet, but was the beginning of the kind of recognition two careful, watchful people extend to each other once they've each confirmed the other isn't a fool. "I only meant I noticed." "Most people don't," Tobias said. "I make a habit of it." He nodded, as though this settled something, and went on with his work, and from that morning forward, there existed between Clara Whitfield and Tobias Reyes an unspoken, entirely practical alliance built on nothing more than the fact that each had recognized in the other a person who paid close attention to the world and said little about what they saw until it mattered. October brought the first real cold, and with it 3 separate signs that Clara's presence on the ranch was doing more than keeping the house clean and the ledger balanced. The first was small. She diagnosed a sickness moving through the calves, a scouring sickness that had killed 2 head on the Pruitt spread the county over, 3 days before Josiah noticed anything wrong, because she had watched her father's field notes long enough to know that animals near a bad water source showed symptoms in a particular order, and she had traced the sickly calves back to a stagnant pool at the low end of the south pasture that the healthy cattle had learned, on their own, to avoid. Josiah fenced the pool off the same afternoon and lost no more calves that autumn, and said nothing about it beyond a short, "Good catch," that Clara understood, from the particular gruffness in his voice, to be the closest thing to a compliment the man knew how to give. The second sign was Daniel. He had begun, without any prompting Clara could identify, to bring her things. A bird's nest fallen from the cottonwood by the well, a rock split clean in half to show the crystal vein inside, the fistful of damp earth from the creek bend he had dug up with his stick, and to wait, with an eagerness he did not show his father, for her to tell him what they meant. Clara answered every question with the same patient thoroughness she had once given her own father's questions on the survey trail. And by the middle of October, Daniel had started following her on her morning walks along the creek bed without being invited, matching his short stride to hers, asking why the clay changed color, why some rocks felt heavier than they looked, why the willows grew where they grew. "Because water is patient," Clara told him, crouching to show him a seep line in the bank no wider than a knife blade. "It doesn't announce itself. You have to learn to see where it's been." Daniel repeated this to his father at supper that night, solemnly, as though reciting scripture, and Josiah looked across the table at his new wife with an expression Clara could not quite read, though she noticed it lasted longer than his usual glances did. The third sign came at the end of October, when a hard frost threatened the last of the garden, and Clara, without consulting anyone, spent an evening covering the rows with burlap sacking, salvaged from the feed store, and arranging smudge pots of smoldering wood shavings between the beds, a trick she had seen a mining camp cook use once in the mountains to save a kitchen garden from an early snow. The garden survived the frost intact, while half of Marrow Creek lost its late vegetables overnight, and when Hannah Merrick heard about it, from Daniel, who told the story with considerable pride at church the following Sunday, she rode over specifically to ask Clara how she'd known to do it. "I've seen worse cold-kill gardens people needed," Clara said simply. "I didn't want to find out if this one counted." It was not, on its face, a remarkable answer. But Hannah, riding home afterward, found herself thinking that there was a great deal more behind that particular woman's calm than the ranch at Marrow Creek had yet had occasion to see. And she was not entirely wrong to wonder what else Clara Whitfield knew that she had not yet found a reason to say aloud. The first real thunderstorm of Clara's time at Marrow Creek broke in the second week of November, rolling in fast off the plains with a violence the dry season hadn't prepared anyone for, lightning cracking close enough to rattle the window panes and thunder rolling flat and hard across the yard in a way that set the horses screaming in the barn. Clara woke to the sound of it and lay still a moment, listening, before she heard a second sound beneath the storm, a thin, muffled crying from Daniel's room, the kind of crying a child tries hard to keep quiet because he has already learned, somehow, that this house does not have much room left in it for anyone's fear but his own. She found him wedged into the corner of his bed, knees drawn to his chest, staring at the window each time the light flashed white behind the curtain, and she did not ask him what was wrong, because she suspected, correctly, that he did not yet have words for it beyond the plain fact of the noise itself. She sat on the edge of the bed instead, not touching him, giving him room to come to her rather than crowding him, and said only, "Thunder's loud. It doesn't have to make sense to be frightening." "Mama used to say it was just angels moving furniture," Daniel said, in a small, cracked voice, the first time he had ever mentioned his mother to Clara directly. "But she's not here to say it no more, and it don't sound like furniture. It sounds like the sky's coming down." Clara considered this a long moment, weighing what her own father might have said, and settled instead on something closer to the plain truth than a comforting story, because she had decided, watching this boy these past weeks, that he deserved honesty even at 6 years old, offered gently rather than withheld out of some adult instinct to protect him from plain facts. "It's not the sky coming down," she said. "It's only air, moving very fast and heating up so quick it cracks like a whip. My own father taught me to count the seconds between the light and the sound. That tells you how far off the storm actually is. Would you like to try it with me?" Daniel nodded, uncertain, and when the next flash came, he counted, in a shaky whisper, up to 11 before the thunder rolled through, and Clara said, 2 miles off, near enough. Moving away from us, not toward us. You'll notice the count gets longer each time now, if you keep track." And it did, flash after flash, the numbers climbing slowly as the storm rolled east across the plains, and by the time Daniel had counted past 20, his shoulders had eased down from around his ears, and he had shifted, without seeming to notice he'd done it, close enough to lean against Clara's arm. "You're not scared of it," he said, somewhere between a question and an observation. "I was. The first bad storm after my own father died," Clara admitted. "Everything feels bigger and more dangerous. For a while, after you've lost somebody, even things that were never actually dangerous to begin with. It gets easier. Not because the storms get smaller, but because you get steadier standing in them." She did not press him to talk further about his mother, only stayed sitting on the edge of his bed, counting seconds between lightning and thunder, until the storm had rolled far enough east that Daniel's eyes had finally slipped closed, his breathing gone slow and even, and she eased herself up only once she was certain he was properly asleep. Josiah was standing in the hallway when she came out, having woken at some point during the storm, and found both of them missing from their beds, and he did not say anything at first, only looked at her with an expression she had not yet learned to read fully, though she would come, in the months ahead, to recognize it as the particular quiet gratitude of a man watching someone else do, gently and without fuss, something he had not known how to do himself since his wife died. "Mary used to sit with him during storms," he said finally, low, so as not to wake the boy. "I never could find the right words. I'd just sit there feeling useless till it passed." "You don't need the right words," Clara said. "You only need to stay in the room. He'll remember that you stayed, longer than he'll remember whatever either of us actually said. Children are like that. They forgive clumsy words far more easily than they forgive an empty chair." Cyrus Colton came around, as Hannah had predicted, before the first hard freeze of November. He rode in on a gray gelding better fed than any horse on his brother's spread, wearing a coat too fine for ranch work, and did not dismount before he began talking. "Heard you took a mail-order wife," he said to Josiah, who had come out from the barn wiping grease from his hands. Cyrus's eyes moved past his brother to the porch, where Clara stood in the doorway with a dish towel, and lingered there a moment with an assessment Clara recognized instantly and did not care for, the look of a man totaling up a woman's worth, the way he might a horse at auction. "Didn't figure you had $11 to spare on foolishness." "Wasn't foolishness, was need," Josiah said. "Household needed a woman in it. Daniel needed a mother. Household needs the note paid at First Bank is what it needs," Cyrus said. $1,180 come next November, and from where I'm sitting, you've added a mouth to feed instead of a hand to help pay it down. He finally swung off the gelding, boots hitting dry ground with a thud that seemed, to Clara's ear, deliberately heavier than necessary. "I could still take the note off your hands, Josiah. Pruitt would sell it to me quick enough. I'd be easier on you than the bank." "You'd want the home section for it," Josiah said. It was not a question. "I'd want what Pa should have left me in the first place," Cyrus said, and there it was, laid bare in 6 words, the single fixed grievance Hannah had described weeks earlier. A man who believed himself owed something the world had failed to deliver, and who measured every conversation against that unpaid debt. "You got the good land because you were the baby, and Ma always did favor you. I got the rocky quarter section and a handshake. I'm not asking for charity, I'm asking for what's fair." "Pass will said what it said," Josiah replied, and Clara could hear, beneath the flatness of his voice, the exhaustion of a man who had had this exact conversation more times than he cared to count. "I'm not selling you the note, Cyrus. Not this year, not next." Cyrus's gaze slid back to the porch. "Your new wife have an opinion on that?" "My wife's opinion is that a man ought to be able to keep what's his without his brothers circling it like a buzzard," Clara said, before Josiah could answer for her, her voice pleasant and entirely without heat, the same tone she might have used to comment on the weather. "But I expect you'd know more about circling than I would, Mr. Colton." For a moment Cyrus looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post that has unexpectedly spoken, and then something flickered behind his eyes. not quite respect, but the beginning of a wary recalculation, before he covered it with a short, humorless laugh and remounted his gelding. "We'll talk again come November," he said, and rode off without another word. And Josiah stood watching the dust settle behind him for a long moment before he said, quietly, not quite looking at Clara, "You didn't have to do that." "No," Clara agreed. "I wanted to." Silas Pruitt, president of First Bank of Merrow Creek, was a different species of trouble entirely. Soft-spoken where Cyrus was blunt, careful where Cyrus was careless, and in Clara's private estimation, considerably more dangerous for it. She met him first at the Mercantile in early November, when she'd ridden into town with Josiah to trade eggs and butter for coffee and thread, and Pruitt had approached them both with the unhurried, proprietary ease of a man greeting people he expected, sooner or later, to own. "Mrs. Colton," he said, tipping his hat, his eyes doing the same slow arithmetic Cyrus's had, though dressed up in considerably better manners. "I hope married life finds you well settled. Your husband and I have some business to discuss, come next fall, but I don't imagine that need trouble you." "Business that touches my household troubles me by definition, Mr. Pruitt," Clara said. "I do the ledgers now. I'd welcome the chance to understand the terms myself, whenever it's convenient." Something crossed Pruitt's face, brief, quickly smoothed over, but Clara caught it, the particular flicker of a man who had built his influence on other people's incomplete understanding of their own obligations and did not care for the prospect of a sharper set of eyes reviewing his paperwork. "Of course," he said. "Of course, though I find the details tend to weary folks who aren't accustomed to banking language." "I find most banking language is arithmetic wearing a coat," Clara said, and smiled, and did not miss the way Pruitt's smile thinned by a fraction before he excused himself toward the counter. The second encounter came 3 weeks later, when Clara rode into town alone to collect the mail and stopped by the bank on the pretext of asking after the exact wording of the Colton note. Pruitt received her in his office with a courtesy that did not extend to actually producing the document, offering instead a summary so vague in its particulars. "The usual terms, Mrs. Colton, nothing unusual, due in full or renegotiated at the bank's discretion." That Clara understood, with the same cold clarity she'd once felt reading her Uncle Rufus's account of her father's estate. That the phrase, "at the bank's discretion," was doing a great deal of quiet, dangerous work in that sentence, and that Silas Pruitt had no intention of letting her see the note itself while there was still time for its terms to be renegotiated in ways that favored the bank or a certain gray gelding's owner over the Coltons. "I'll want a copy for our records," Clara said, standing, smoothing her skirt, giving nothing away. "I'm sure that's a simple enough request." "I'm sure it is," Pruitt said, and did not produce one that day, and Clara rode home turning the exchange over in her mind the whole 4 miles, filing Silas Pruitt beside Cyrus Colton in the small, precise ledger she kept of people whose calculated opportunism might, sooner or later, require a countermeasure. Agatha Beadle, wife of the Mercantile's owner, required no such careful reading, because Agatha Beadle's suspicions announced themselves the moment Clara was out of earshot, and sometimes when she was not quite far enough out of it. Clara heard the first version of it second-hand, from Hannah, who reported it with the particular relish of a woman repeating gossip, specifically so it could be dismantled. Agatha had told the sewing circle that a woman who married a stranger for a roof over her head was either desperate or hiding something, and that the fine stitching on Clara's traveling dress, real Georgia needlework, not the coarse cotton most mail-order brides arrived in, suggested the latter. "She's not wrong that the stitching's fine," Clara said, when Hannah relayed it, without any particular alarm. "It was my mother's dress before it was mine. I let the hem down myself. I don't imagine Mrs. Beadle would find that half so interesting as whatever she's decided instead." "She's decided you're running from something," Hannah said. "A husband, most likely, in her version, or debts. "She's not entirely wrong about the debts," Clara said, dry, and offered nothing further, and Hannah, who had learned by now not to press when Clara's voice took on that particular flatness, let the subject drop. The second instance was less easily shrugged off. It came at a church social in mid-November, when Agatha, emboldened by an audience of 4 other women near the refreshment table, asked Clara directly, in a voice pitched to Carrie, whether it was true that her own family hadn't come to see her off. "My father is dead, Mrs. Beadle," Clara said, and the plain, unadorned fact of it landed in the small circle of women with more weight than any defense could have carried. "My uncle managed the estate after. He felt a fresh start out west would suit me better than staying in a house that was no longer mine to keep." I expect he wasn't entirely wrong, though I don't imagine he meant it as a kindness. She let that sit a moment, watching Agatha's face work through the discomfort of having asked a question whose honest answer was considerably sadder than the scandal she'd been fishing for. "Was there something else you wanted to know?" There was not, as it turned out, and Agatha Beadle spent the remainder of the social finding reasons to stand near the punch bowl instead, though she would return to the subject of Clara Whitfield's mysterious past more than once before winter was through, each time with slightly less certainty than the time before, because a woman who answered hard questions plainly made considerably less interesting gossip than one who dodged them. The letter came in the first week of December, tucked among seed catalogs and a note from the county extension office, addressed in a hand Clara had not seen in 8 months and had not expected to see again. She recognized the looping, self-satisfied slant of it before she'd even turned the envelope over to read the sender's name, and something in her chest went very still and very cold. Emmett Vance, Charleston, South Carolina. She did not open it at the kitchen table. She carried it out to the barn, where Tobias was mending harness leather by lantern light, and sat on an overturned bucket to read it alone, because she had learned long ago that whatever news Emmett Vance chose to send would need to be absorbed before it could safely be spoken about, and she did not yet know which kind of news this was. "My dear Clara," it began, in a tone of easy familiarity that made her jaw tighten before she'd finished the salutation. "It has taken some doing to learn where your uncle sent you, and I confess I was more surprised than I ought to have been to hear you'd been packed off to Texas like so much unwanted freight. I always told you Rufus Whitfield was not a man to be trusted with another person's welfare, your own included. I will not pretend this letter is purely a matter of sentiment, though I have not forgotten our understanding, nor do I consider it dissolved simply because your circumstances changed so abruptly after your father's death. I have had occasion this past month to speak with a surveyor who once worked alongside your father on the Sacramento line in New Mexico Territory, and he mentioned, in the course of an entirely unrelated conversation, a parcel of land your father was known to have purchased privately in his final year, land the surveyor believed, based on Edwin's own notes, to sit atop a considerable silver deposit. I have made inquiries at the New Mexico Territorial Land Office. No deed for such a parcel appears in your uncle's estate filings, which raises the interesting question, my dear Clara, of where that deed has gotten to. I do not say this to threaten you, only to observe that a woman alone in a strange territory, married in haste to a man she'd never met, might find herself glad of a friend who remembers what she's owed and is willing to see it properly settled, for both our sakes. I intend to travel west myself in the spring to look into the matter personally. I trust we can discuss it as reasonable people, and that your new husband need never learn more about your family's business than is strictly necessary to keep the peace of his household. Your faithful friend, always, Emmett Vance. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time, and sat a long while in the lantern light with it folded in her lap, while Tobias worked the harness leather beside her and said nothing, because he had learned in 3 months on the Colton Ranch that Clara Whitfield's silences were their own kind of communication and did not require filling. "Bad news?" he asked finally, when she folded the letter a final time and tucked it inside her sleeve. "An old debt," Clara said. "Coming due sooner than I'd hoped." She looked at him a moment, weighing something. "Tobias, if a man came asking after me, asking questions in town, at the bank, wherever he could find an ear, would you hear about it before I did?" "Likely," Tobias said. "I hear most things eventually. It's a habit." "Then I'd take it as a kindness if you'd tell me first, whatever it was." Tobias set down the harness and looked at her directly, and something passed between them again, the same wordless recognition from the fence line months before, now grown into something closer to an understanding. "You've been square with me since I got here," he said. "Didn't ask questions about the leg, didn't ask questions about where I come from before this. I don't forget that kind of thing." He picked the harness back up. "You'll hear it from me first." She did not tell Josiah about the letter that night, nor the night after. She told herself it was because the threat was not yet concrete enough to burden him with. Emmett had said spring, and spring was months away, time enough to think, to plan, to decide what to do about a deed that named her sole owner of land, a man in Charleston had no legal claim to whatsoever, whatever he believed her family owed him. But underneath that reasoning sat a quieter, less comfortable truth, which was that she did not yet know whether Josiah Colton, when he learned his wife had come to him carrying a hidden inheritance worth vastly more than the ranch he was fighting to keep, would see it as good fortune or as a lie of omission he could not forgive. She had been lied to and used by people who claimed to love her once already. She was not yet ready to risk finding out whether her own husband would prove any different. Not until she understood the ground beneath that question better than she currently did. The bank trouble, meanwhile, did not wait for spring. Silas Pruitt sent formal notice in mid-December, delivered by his own hand, which Josiah remarked afterward was unusual enough to be its own kind of message, that the bank's board had reviewed outstanding notes ahead of the new year and found it prudent to request a partial payment of $400 by the 1st of February, against the principal due the following November, in light of certain concerns regarding the herd's condition after the summer's drought. $400 we don't have, Josiah said, reading the notice at the kitchen table with the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he already knows will not come out in his favor. "Herd's in fine condition, better than half the counties, with the culling we did. This isn't about the herd." "No," Clara agreed, reading over his shoulder. "This is about your brother having a conversation with Mr. Pruitt that neither of them intends for you to hear about directly." She sat down across from him. "Cyrus said he could take the note off your hands. If the bank calls part of it due early and you can't pay, they don't foreclose on you outright. That would look poorly for a bank that wants a reputation for fairness. They sell the note instead, to whoever's already expressed an interest in buying it." Josiah's hands had gone still on the table. "You think Cyrus is paying Pruitt to squeeze me?" "I think your brother believes he's owed something the world hasn't paid him, and men like that don't generally wait patiently for the world to change its mind," Clara said. "I think Mr. Pruitt is the kind of man who finds it more comfortable to help a scheme along quietly than to be seen refusing a favor to someone who might one day be useful to him. I don't have proof of either thing, but I'd wager the ranch on it before I'd wager on coincidence." Josiah sat with that a long moment, jaw working, and Clara watched something harden in him that had not been there before. Not despair, which she thought she could have managed, but a kind of grim, cornered resolve that worried her more, because cornered men made decisions in haste that patient ones would not. $400 by February, he said finally. "We've got maybe 260 put by if I sell off the 3 steers I was saving for spring breeding stock. That leaves us short, and no breeding stock besides." "Then we find the rest," Clara said, "or we find another way to make the shortfall not matter." She did not say more than that, not yet, because the other way she was already turning over in her mind, the willow line along the creek bed, the seep no wider than a knife blade, the gray clay that did not match its neighbors, was not yet certain enough to offer as a plan, only a suspicion she intended to test properly before she let anyone's hope rest on it. Cyrus rode over twice more before Christmas, each visit shorter and less patient than the last, each time repeating some version of the same offer. He would buy the note from Pruitt, he would be easier on Josiah than the bank. All Josiah had to do was see reason and let him take the home section as the fair price of rescue. And each time Josiah refused with a stubbornness that seemed to surprise even Cyrus, who had perhaps expected the addition of a wife and a tightening banknote to soften his brother's resolve rather than harden it. "You're going to lose it anyway," Cyrus said, on the second visit, dismounting this time, standing close enough to his brother that Clara, watching from the porch with Daniel's small hand in hers, felt her whole body go tense. "Better you lose it to blood than to a stranger bank in Fort Worth that'll sell it to God knows who. I'm offering you a mercy, Josiah, and you're too proud to take it. You're offering yourself 200 acres of good bottomland for the price of a debt you didn't create and don't intend to pay off any faster than I would," Josiah said. "That's not mercy. That's patience dressed up as kindness, and I've watched you practice it my whole life." Cyrus's face went red, and for a moment Clara thought he might do something rash, strike his brother or worse. But he only remounted, sharp and furious, and said, before he rode off, "Come February, you remember I offered." "I'll remember," Josiah said quietly, watching him go, and beside him Clara said nothing at all, only reached down and gathered Daniel up onto her hip, because the boy had gone very white, watching the two grown men he loved, and feared in equal measure, square off in the yard, and some things needed comforting before they needed strategizing. That night, after Daniel was asleep, Clara sat by lamplight at the kitchen table with the household ledger open before her, and beside it, unopened for the first time since she'd carried it across 3 states, her father's field notebook. She did not open the notebook that night either, but she set her hand flat against its cover, the way she had that first evening in her new bedroom, and understood that the season of waiting she had allowed herself was drawing to a close, whether she felt ready for it or not. She told Josiah 2 days after Christmas, on a morning cold enough that their breath hung visible in the kitchen and the coffee stayed hot only a few minutes before the chill claimed it. She had decided, lying awake most of the night turning the decision over, that a marriage built on omissions was not the kind of foundation she wanted for whatever this arrangement was becoming, and that Josiah Colton had earned, through 3 months of steady, unglamorous decency, at least the truth about who he had actually married. "My father was a mineral surveyor," she said, setting the notebook on the table between them before he'd finished his first cup. 18 years, for railroads and mining concerns, across Georgia, the Carolinas, and out into the territories the last few years of his life. I rode with him on surveys from the time I was 12. I know how to read ground, Josiah. Water tables, ore veins, soil that promises more than it shows on the surface. It's not guesswork when I stop to look at things. It's a trade I was taught same as any apprentice. Only nobody ever called it that, because I was a girl doing it alongside her father instead of a boy doing it for wages. Josiah set down his cup very slowly and looked at her, and Clara made herself hold his gaze because she had promised herself she would not flinch from this conversation however it went. "Why didn't you say so before?" "Because the first time in my life I told the truth about what I knew and what I had, someone I trusted used it against me," Clara said. "My uncle discovered, going through my father's papers after he died, that there was more to the estate than debts, and he made certain nothing of it reached me before he'd taken what he wanted and arranged to have me sent somewhere I couldn't ask questions about the rest. I learned, watching that happen, that a woman's knowledge is safest kept quiet until she understands exactly who she's dealing with." She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that the gesture carried its own weight. "I've spent 3 months understanding who I'm dealing with, Josiah. I don't think you're my uncle. I think you're a man who's been so busy trying to hold this ranch together with his bare hands that it hasn't occurred to him his wife might actually be able to help carry some of the weight, if he'd let her." Josiah was quiet a long moment, turning his cup in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice had none of the sharpness she'd half braced for. "That willow line," he said, "along the East Creek bend, the one you told Daniel about. There's water under that bank," Clara said. "Not surface water. It's too deep and too slow for that, which is why the creek looks dry to anyone glancing at it. But the clay color, the willow growth, the way the ground held its dampness even in October, that's a seep pattern I've seen before, in New Mexico, on ground that looked every bit as dead as this does. My father would have called it a strong candidate for a shallow well, maybe even an artesian source, if the layering underneath runs the way I think it does. I wanted to test it properly before I said anything, because a woman crying water in a drought and being wrong about it doesn't get taken seriously twice. And if you're right—" "If I'm right," Clara said, "you have year-round water on land that's been worth exactly what the drought made it worth for 2 years running. And Cyrus Colton and Silas Pruitt can circle all they like, because a ranch with its own water source doesn't go begging to a bank that's decided its herd looks poorly." Josiah sat with this a long moment, and Clara watched him do the same silent arithmetic she'd watched him do with the note at First Bank, except this time the numbers seemed to be coming out in his favor, and something in his face, guarded, careful, unused to good news arriving without a catch attached, eased by a fraction she found she had been hoping to see. "What do you need to test it?" he asked, properly. "A shovel, a length of rope, about a day's work, and Tobias, if he's willing," Clara said. "He's got a tracker's eye. He'll see what I see faster than most, and he won't panic if it turns out I'm wrong." Tobias, when asked, agreed without hesitation, and the three of them spent the better part of a bitter, clear-skied morning at the creek bend, digging test holes at intervals Clara marked out with more precision than either man had watched a woman apply to ranch work before, checking the color and dampness of the soil at each depth, noting where the clay shifted, where the willow roots ran deepest. By early afternoon, at a depth of just over 6 feet, the third test hole struck ground damp enough to darken a handful of dirt within seconds of exposure to open air, and by the fourth hole, dug at Clara's direction 20 yards further along the bend where she believed the underlying rock shelf would pinch the water table closer to the surface, they struck standing water at just past 5 feet, cold and clear and, when Tobias cupped a handful to his mouth to taste it, entirely sweet. Daniel, who had insisted on coming along and had spent most of the morning losing interest and wandering off to examine rocks, came running back at the sound of Josiah's short, disbelieving laugh and stood at the edge of the hole staring down at the dark, wet earth with the same wide-eyed wonder he might have given a magic trick. "Told you the willows knew something," Clara said to him, and Daniel looked up at her with an expression of such uncomplicated pride and delight that Clara felt something loosen in her own chest that had been held tight since the morning she'd stepped down from the stagecoach 3 months before. Josiah did not say much on the ride back to the house, but that evening, after Daniel had gone to bed full of talk about magic water and rocks with crystals inside, he found Clara at the kitchen table with the ledger and sat down across from her, instead of retreating to the porch as he usually did after a hard day's work. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For marrying a woman I thought I understood the whole of after one letter and a look at a stagecoach step," he said. "You've been carrying twice the load I gave you credit for since the day you got here, and you did it quiet enough I nearly missed it." Clara considered him a moment, the tired lines around his eyes, the careful, unshowy way he'd said it. No more performance in the apology than there had been in anything else the man had ever told her, and decided, in that moment, that whatever remained unsaid about the deed sewn into her trunk's false bottom could wait a while longer yet, not out of fear now, but because she wanted, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, to simply sit a while in a kitchen with someone who had earned her trust the slow, ordinary way, before the rest of the truth came due. "You don't owe me an apology," she said finally. "You gave me a roof and a fair arrangement when you had every reason to want less trouble than a wife with opinions. I'd call that square." She closed the ledger. "But I'll take the thanks. if you're offering it." "I'm offering it," Josiah said, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Marrow Creek, his voice carried something warmer than gratitude, though neither of them had a name yet for what it might be becoming. It was Daniel, in the end, who put a name to a smaller piece of it first, in his own 6-year-old way, a few evenings later. He had found, rummaging through the tin box where Clara kept a handful of small keepsakes on top of her dresser, the little paper twist of peppermint she had promised him on her very first afternoon in Marrow Creek, and had, in the business of settling into a new marriage, and a failing well, and a banknote come due, genuinely forgotten to produce. "You said you had peppermint," Daniel said, holding up the twist of candy with the solemn accusation of a child who does not forget promises even when the adult who made them does. "You said you didn't know yet if I liked it, but you'd find out. That was a long time ago." Clara looked at the little paper twist, faded now and slightly crushed from months at the bottom of a trunk and then a tin box, and felt something catch in her chest that had nothing to do with Wells or notes or Emmett Vance's letter still folded in her sleeve. "You're right," she said. "I did say that, and I let it slip clean out of my mind. That was careless of me. I don't like being careless with promises, especially not to you." She took the twist from him and unwrapped it carefully, breaking the peppermint stick in half, offering him the larger piece. "Well, let's find out properly then. Better 4 months late than never." Daniel considered the peppermint with great seriousness, turning it over once before biting into it, and after a moment's careful chewing, pronounced, with the gravity of a much older person delivering a verdict on a fine wine, "I like it. I like it a lot." "Then I'll see we keep some in the house from now on," Clara said, "so neither of us has to wait 4 months for the next one." Josiah, watching this small exchange from the doorway with an armload of firewood he'd forgotten he was carrying, found himself smiling in a way he hadn't allowed himself much since Mary died. Not the careful, dutiful half-smile he'd learned to manage for Daniel's sake on hard days, but something looser and more unguarded, the smile of a man watching a household knit itself back together in small, ordinary moments he had stopped believing he'd get to see again. Clara caught him at it, glancing up from the peppermint twist, and neither of them said anything about it, but something passed between them across the width of that kitchen. Not yet the settled, easy affection of years still to come, but its first honest beginning, and Clara understood, setting the rest of the peppermint stick carefully back in its paper twist for later, that whatever this arrangement had started as, it had already become something considerably more worth tending than either of them had bargained for on the day the marriage agency's letters first crossed between Georgia and Texas. Emmett Vance did not wait for spring. He arrived in Marrow Creek on the second Tuesday of February, 3 months ahead of his own promised schedule, stepping off the same stagecoach line Clara had ridden in on the previous autumn, dressed in a city coat entirely wrong for the weather, and carrying himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never once in his life doubted that circumstances would eventually rearrange themselves to suit him. Tobias heard of it first, exactly as he'd promised he would. He rode in from town at a hard trot 2 hours after the stage arrived, having heard the stranger asking questions at the Mercantile about a Mrs. Colton who'd come out from Georgia the previous fall, and found Clara in the kitchen garden, salvaging the last of the winter greens. "Man in a city coat's in town asking after you by your maiden name," Tobias said, swinging down from his horse. "Charleston accent. Agatha Beetle's already got half the sewing circle wondering why a fine gentleman's come looking for a rancher's wife." Clara felt the cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the February wind. Did he say what he wanted? Said he was an old family friend, come to pay his respects. Tobias's expression made clear what he thought of that description. "Didn't sit right with me. Man asking after a married woman's maiden name in a town that small, 3 months early by his own letter, if you follow, that's not a social call, Clara." "No," Clara agreed, "it isn't." She set down the basket of greens and understood, with the same flat clarity she'd felt reading Emmett's letter in the barn 2 months before, that the season of careful, patient waiting had finally, entirely run out. "I need to speak with Josiah, tonight, before Mr. Vance decides to save himself the trouble of waiting for an invitation." She told Josiah everything that night, the whole of it, sitting across the kitchen table with the sealed deed finally broken open between them and the notebook laid flat beside it. The New Mexico land her father had quietly purchased in his final year, the silver deposit his field notes suggested lay beneath it, the sole and separate title that named Clara Whitfield, and now by marriage Clara Colton, as its only legal owner, safe from any claim her uncle or Emmett Vance might attempt to press. She told him about the informal understanding her family had once encouraged between herself and Emmett, an understanding she had never fully consented to and had considered entirely dissolved the moment her father died and Emmett's attention shifted, with an ugliness she had not forgotten, toward the question of what remained of the Whitfield estate. She told him about the letter in December, the threat wrapped in the language of old friendship, and her own silence about all of it these past 2 months, not from any wish to deceive him, but from a fear, honestly named now for the first time, that a fortune revealed too soon might have looked to him like a lie rather than a gift. Josiah listened without interrupting, the way he had learned to listen to her over the past 3 months, and when she finished, he sat quiet a long moment, with his hand resting near the deed but not touching it, as though he understood it was not yet fully his to handle. "You thought I'd resent you for it," he said finally, "for having more than I do." "I thought you might wonder what else I hadn't said," Clara said, "and I wouldn't have blamed you for it. I came into this marriage with a secret sewn into my trunk. That's not nothing, whatever the reason behind it. The reason behind it is a family that used your own trust against you once already," Josiah said. "I don't fault a woman for being careful after that. I'd fault myself more for expecting otherwise." He looked at the deed a moment longer, then back at her. "This Vance fellow, he mean to press some claim on it?" "He means to press a claim on me," Clara said, "and use the deed as leverage to get it. He'll say I owe him some old obligation, dress it up as concern for my welfare, and imply, loud enough for the whole town to hear if it comes to that a woman who married in such haste and kept such secrets can't have been entirely honest with her new husband about anything else either. He wants to unsettle you as much as he wants the land, Josiah. A rattled husband is easier to maneuver around than a steady one." "Then he's picked the wrong husband to rattle," Josiah said, and something in the plain certainty of it settled a knot in Clara's chest she had been carrying, without fully naming it, since the moment she'd read his name on that envelope. They did not have long to plan. Emmett called at the ranch 2 days later, uninvited, arriving in a hired buggy with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of a man who believed the mere fact of his presence constituted an argument in his favor. Josiah met him in the yard before he'd reached the porch steps. "Mr. Vance," Josiah said, "my wife mentioned you might come calling." If this cost Emmett any of his composure, he did not show it. "Mr. Colton, I confess I hadn't expected quite so direct a welcome. I'd hoped for a private word with Clara, for old time's sake. Anything you've got to say to my wife, you can say to us both," Josiah said. "We don't keep separate business in this house." Emmett's smile thinned but held. How refreshingly modern. "Very well." He glanced toward Clara, who had come to stand beside Josiah on the porch, her expression giving away nothing at all. "Clara, my dear, I've come a long way to make certain you're being properly looked after, given how abruptly your circumstances changed. I understand there's a matter of some property, land your father purchased shortly before his death, never properly settled with the rest of the estate. I've spoken with the New Mexico Land Office. There's no record of the title's disposition. It occurred to me you might not even be aware such a valuable asset existed, tucked away as it likely was among your father's private papers, and I'd hate to see a woman cheated of her rightful inheritance simply for want of someone looking out for her interests." "How considerate of you," Clara said. As it happens, Mr. Vance, I am entirely aware of the property. My father recorded the deed in my name 11 months before he died, specified as my sole and separate holding, exempt from my uncle's guardianship and from any marital community property claim either. My father was thorough that way. I have the document in the house. I've had it since before I ever left Georgia. Something flickered across Emmett's face, the first genuine crack in his composure since he'd stepped down from the buggy, quickly smoothed over, but not quickly enough. Then you'll understand, he said, recovering, that given our prior understanding, a claim of some kind might reasonably— There was no understanding, Mr. Vance, Clara said, cutting through the sentence before it could finish forming into whatever shape he'd intended. There was a suggestion made by my father and your family that we might suit, which I never accepted and you never formally pursued, being considerably more occupied, as I recall, with the question of my father's professional connections than with any genuine regard for me. I owe you nothing. I never did. And I'd remind you that arriving uninvited at a married woman's home to press a claim on property that is legally and exclusively hers, backed by nothing more than an old and one-sided understanding, is the sort of behavior a circuit judge would take a very dim view of, should it come to that. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Colton? Emmett's voice had lost its silky ease entirely now. I'm informing you, Clara said. There's a difference, though I understand it may not always be visible from where you're standing. Josiah, who had watched this entire exchange with his arms folded and his expression unreadable, spoke for the first time since the introductions. I believe my wife's made herself clear, Mr. Vance. You've had your word. I'll ask you not to trouble this household again. Emmett looked between them a long moment, the steady rancher and the wife who had just dismantled his entire argument without raising her voice. And something in his calculation visibly shifted. The recognition of a man realizing the ground he'd expected to find soft had turned out to be considerably harder than advertised. This isn't finished, he said, though the words carried less conviction than he likely intended. I'll be in Marrow Creek a while yet. There are people in this town curious enough about a mail-order bride's history that they might welcome a fuller account of it than the one you've given them. Then I expect you'll find, Clara said, that the good people of Marrow Creek have grown considerably less interested in idle speculation than they might have been 4 months ago, and considerably more interested in results. You're welcome to try your account against mine in front of the whole town, Mr. Vance. I'd think it over carefully first. Emmett left without another word, the buggy wheels cutting hard through the yard's frozen ruts, and Josiah exhaled a breath Clara suspected he'd been holding the better part of 10 minutes. He'll try the town next, Josiah said. Same as he tried Cyrus's trick with the bank, only aimed at your name instead of my note. He'll try, Clara agreed, which is why I think we ought to make sure that when he does, he's not the one holding the only account anybody's heard yet. She looked toward the East Creek bend, where the test holes still sat marked with stakes under a thin crust of February frost, and toward the barn, where Tobias was even now finishing the framework for a proper hand-dug well. Founders' Gathering is in 3 weeks, at the church grounds. Whole county turns out for it. If we're going to settle this, Emmett, your brother, Mr. Pruitt and his convenient timing, all of it, I'd rather it happen once, in front of everyone, than drag on all spring in whispers. Josiah looked at her a long moment, something like admiration working its way into the tired lines of his face. You've got a plan. I've got the beginnings of one, Clara said. Give me 3 weeks, and I'll have the rest. The well came in properly on the 9th of February, 4 days before the bank's payment deadline, after Tobias and 2 hired men from the Merrick place worked a week of frozen mornings hand-digging and shoring the shaft Clara had staked out at the creek bend. When the water finally rose to fill the bottom 6 feet of the shaft, clear and cold and steady, replenishing overnight at a rate Tobias measured with a marked rope and pronounced, in his understated way, better than anything I've seen dug by hand in this county, Josiah stood at the rim of it a long while, hat off, saying nothing, in a way Clara had come to recognize as the man's particular way of holding something too large for words. "That's water enough for the herd through any drought this land's likely to throw at us," Tobias said. "And enough left over, if you dug the second shaft Clara marked out, to run a proper irrigation ditch down to the bottom pasture. Man could grow hay on that ground instead of just grazing it thin." Josiah put his hat back on. "Bank doesn't lend against a well," he said, half to himself. "But a bank looking to protect its own investment might think twice about calling a note early against a ranch that just doubled its carrying capacity in a single county's worst drought in a decade. That's not sentiment. That's arithmetic even Silas Pruitt can't argue with in front of his own board." He rode into Marrow Creek 2 days before the deadline and asked, plainly, for a meeting with the full bank board rather than Pruitt alone, a request Pruitt could not easily refuse without drawing exactly the kind of attention to his own conduct that Clara had suspected he wished to avoid. Clara went with him, ledger in hand, and laid out for the 3 board members, in the same clear, unhurried arithmetic she'd used to correct Josiah's household accounts back in September, precisely what the new well meant for the ranch's herd capacity, its hay yield, and its resale value, should the bank ever actually be forced to foreclose and sell the land itself. A prospect, she pointed out without raising her voice, that would net the bank considerably less than simply extending the note's full term at its original interest, now that the collateral had meaningfully improved. "You'll forgive me for asking, Mrs. Colton," said one of the board members, an older man named Whitcomb who ran the feed store and had known both Colton brothers since they were boys, "how a rancher's wife comes to speak so plainly about collateral valuation." "My father was a mineral and land surveyor for 18 years, Mr. Whitcomb," Clara said. "I learned to read what ground was worth before I learned to read most novels. I'd be glad to walk any of you out to see the well yourselves, if the bank would find that reassuring." They did not call the $400 due. The board voted, with Whitcomb visibly the deciding voice, to extend the full note at its original terms through the following November, citing the improved collateral, and Silas Pruitt, seated at the end of the table throughout the entire proceeding, said almost nothing, his careful, unbothered composure cracking just slightly at the corners in a way that told Clara, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much of the earlier pressure had indeed come from a conversation he'd rather no one examine too closely. Cyrus heard the news within a day, the way news traveled in a county that small, and rode over one final time that February, though with none of his earlier bluster. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard a long moment, not dismounting, watching Daniel and Clara filling buckets at the new well while Josiah worked nearby, and said only, when Josiah walked over, "Well's a fine piece of work." "It is," Josiah said, giving nothing away. "Guess you won't be needing my offer then." "Guess I won't." Cyrus nodded slowly, some old familiar bitterness still working behind his eyes, but something else there too now, a grudging, unwilling flicker of the same recalculation he'd shown Clara back in November, the beginning, though neither man could have named it yet, of a much longer road toward whatever reconciliation the 2 brothers might eventually manage. He rode off without another word, and this time Josiah did not watch him go with the same tight, braced posture he'd worn all winter, but simply turned back to his work, the matter, for the moment, settled. With the immediate crisis past, Clara turned her attention to the second half of what she had begun quietly planning weeks before, in the margins of the household ledger and the long, wakeful hours after Daniel and Josiah had gone to sleep. The New Mexico land, 160 acres her father's notes suggested, sat atop a silver deposit worth a fortune neither she nor Josiah had any experience managing alone, was not land either of them wished to work themselves, 400 miles from the ranch that had become, in 5 short months, genuinely theirs. But it was land that could be leased to a mining concern for a fair royalty, properly negotiated, without either of them ever needing to leave Merrow Creek, and Clara had already begun drafting careful letters to two established mining companies in Santa Fe, using her father's own notebook and survey terminology to establish, beyond any easy dismissal, that she understood precisely what she was offering and precisely what it was worth. The royalties, when the first lease was finally signed that spring with a modest but reputable firm out of Santa Fe, did not make the Coltons wealthy overnight. Clara had been careful, in the negotiation, to favor a smaller upfront payment against steady long-term percentage royalties, rather than a single large sale that might have drawn Emmett Vance's renewed and considerably more aggressive attention. But it settled, permanently and without further argument, the note at First Bank, freed enough capital to expand the herd properly the following year, and left a meaningful surplus besides, a surplus Clara, when Josiah asked her one evening what she meant to do with her share of it, answered with a plan she had been quietly building since her very first week in Merrow Creek. Watching Daniel's hunger for every scrap of knowledge she offered him, and remembering her own father's insistence, unusual for his time, that a daughter's education mattered every bit as much as a son's. A schoolhouse, she said. A proper one, not just the one back room at the church the circuit teacher uses 3 months a year when she can be spared. Somewhere the children in this county, girls same as boys, can learn their letters and their arithmetic, and maybe, eventually, some of what my father taught me about the ground beneath their feet. Merrow Creek's going to keep growing, drought or no drought, it ought to have something worth growing toward. Josiah was quiet a moment, and then he said, in the plain, unshowy way she had come to recognize as his deepest form of approval, then we'd best find a good stretch of ground for it. Somewhere with decent water nearby. Clara laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had not allowed herself often since her father's death, and said she thought she knew just the spot. The night before the founders' gathering, with Emmett's arrival still hanging over the household and Daniel long asleep, Clara sat up late at the kitchen table going over, one final time, exactly what she meant to say if Emmett Vance forced the confrontation into public view the way she suspected he would. Josiah found her there past midnight, the lamp burned low, her father's notebook open beside the deed for reference, and instead of urging her to bed, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat. The way he had that evening months before when he'd first thanked her properly for all she'd carried quietly on his behalf. You don't have to do this alone tomorrow, he said. Whatever he says, whatever anybody in that churchyard whispers before you've had the chance to answer it, I'll be standing right beside you the whole while. Not because I need to be seen defending my wife's honor in front of the county, but because you're not carrying this by yourself anymore, and I'd like you to actually believe that, not just know it as a fact I've stated. Clara looked at him a long moment across the low lamplight, and found, to her own mild surprise, that her eyes had gone unexpectedly damp. I've spent most of my life being the one who carries things quietly so nobody else has to, she said. It's a hard habit to set down, even when I trust the person offering to help hold the weight. Then set it down slow, Josiah said. I'm not going anywhere while you work out how. There's no calendar on it. Take whatever time the setting down actually needs. She reached across the table then and took his hand. Not a dramatic gesture, nothing like the declarations she imagined other women's courtships might have included, but steady and deliberate, the same way she did most things, and he closed his fingers around hers without hesitation, and the two of them sat that way a while longer in the low lamplight, saying nothing further, because by then there was very little left that needed saying aloud between them, and a great deal that had already, quietly and without either of them quite marking the exact day it happened, come to be understood. The Founders' Gathering fell, that year, on the first Saturday of March, held as it always was on the church grounds at the center of Merrow Creek, with tables of food laid out under bunting, strung between the hitching posts, and nearly every family within 20 miles turned out for an afternoon that marked, more than any other single day, the town's sense of itself as a community rather than a scattering of isolated ranches. Clara had chosen the date deliberately and had spent the preceding weeks making certain, through careful, unhurried conversations with Hannah and with Whitcomb from the bank board, that a particular kind of news would already be circulating quietly by the time the gathering arrived. Not gossip exactly, but the plain, verifiable fact of a well dug and a note extended and a schoolhouse fund already being discussed, so that whatever account Emmett Vance intended to offer the town would arrive into an atmosphere considerably less credulous than the one he'd originally hoped to find. He came anyway, as Clara had expected he would, arriving at the edge of the gathering in his city coat with the particular forced ease of a man determined to appear unbothered. He made his way, with deliberate slowness, toward the knot of women near the refreshment table where Agatha Beadle stood, and Clara, watching from across the churchyard with Daniel's hand in hers, understood exactly what he intended before he'd said a single word. "Lovely gathering," Emmett said, loud enough to draw the attention of several nearby families. "Though I confess, Mrs. Beadle, I'm surprised to find such warmth extended to a woman who arrived in this town under rather more complicated circumstances than she's likely let on. It's a hard thing, watching a family's fortune slip away through no fault of decent, honest people, simply because a young woman chose to disappear west with property that was never rightly settled." Agatha, to her credit, and Clara would think of this, in the years that followed, as the true turning point in whatever grudging respect eventually grew between them, did not immediately seize the gossip the way Emmett clearly hoped she would. "I don't believe I follow you, Mr. Vance," she said instead, with the caution of a woman who had, over the winter, watched every one of her own suspicions about Clara Colton answered plainly and found wanting. By then, Josiah had crossed the churchyard, Clara at his side, and the small crowd that had begun to gather sensed, with the particular instinct small towns develop for exactly this kind of moment, that something was about to be settled in front of them. "Mr. Vance seems to have more to say about my family's business than he's managed to say to my face in private," Clara said, her voice carrying clear and even across the yard. "Since he's chosen a public gathering for it, I expect the rest of you deserve a public answer, rather than whatever version reaches you afterward second-hand." She looked around at the assembled families, Whitcomb from the bank, Hannah with her arms folded, Silas Pruitt standing somewhat apart near the punch table with an expression carefully arranged into neutrality. Even Cyrus, arrived late, and watching from the edge of the crowd with an unreadable stillness. My father, Edwin Whitfield, was a mineral surveyor. Before he died, he purchased a small parcel of land in New Mexico Territory and recorded the deed in my name alone, my sole and separate property, by his own careful design, exempt from any claim my uncle or anyone else might later attempt to press. Mr. Vance learned of this land some months after my father's death, and has since suggested, first in a private letter and now in front of all of you, that some old family understanding entitles him to a claim on it. There was no such understanding. There was a suggestion once made between our families that came to nothing, well before my father's death, and Mr. Vance's sudden and considerable interest in reviving it appears to have arrived precisely when the land in question was discovered to hold value he hadn't previously troubled himself to notice. "That is a considerable exaggeration of the facts," Emmett began, but his voice had already lost the easy confidence it carried at the letter's writing, and the crowd's attention, Clara noted, had shifted from curious to something closer to skeptical. "The facts are recorded at the New Mexico Territorial Land Office, which Mr. Vance himself consulted, by his own account, before ever writing to me," Clara said. "The facts are also that I have leased the mineral rights to a Santa Fe firm under entirely legal terms, that the royalties from that lease have already settled my husband's note at First Bank in full, and that not $1 of it has ever been, or will ever be, subject to any claim Mr. Vance imagines he holds. I'd welcome him to pursue the matter through a circuit judge, if he believes otherwise. I understand Judge Aldrich holds court in Fort Worth the second week of every month. The silence that followed held a particular quality Clara would remember for years afterward, not the hush of scandal confirmed, which was clearly what Emmett had hoped to provoke, but the flatter, more final silence of a man's entire strategy collapsing in front of an audience that had, quite plainly, stopped believing him somewhere in the middle of Clara's second sentence. "I think," Whitcomb said into that silence, mild as ever but carrying easily across the yard, "that settles the matter about as thoroughly as it needs settling. Mrs. Colton's account matches the bank's own records of the note's satisfaction, for whatever that's worth to anyone still wondering." He looked toward Emmett with the plain, unhurried directness of a man who had run a feed store in a small town for 30 years and had developed, in that time, a reliable instinct for exactly this kind of visitor. "Merrow Creek's a friendly enough town to honest business, Mr. Vance. I expect the stage runs east again Tuesday." Emmett looked around the churchyard once more, at the families no longer troubling to hide their skepticism, at Agatha Beadle studying the ground rather than meeting his eye, at Josiah standing solid and unmoved beside his wife, and seemed, in that final moment, to understand fully that whatever leverage he had imagined himself holding over Clara Colton had evaporated entirely somewhere between Georgia and Texas. He left without further argument, and the stage did in fact carry him east the following Tuesday, and no one in Merrow Creek ever saw or heard from Emmett Vance again. Cyrus approached later that afternoon, once the gathering had settled back into its ordinary rhythm of food and conversation, finding Josiah near the well-digging tools Tobias had brought to show off to a cluster of curious neighbors. He did not apologize outright, that would come later, and more slowly, over years rather than an afternoon, but he stood beside his brother a long moment, watching Daniel show off a chunk of quartz to a group of other children with the same proud seriousness he'd once shown Clara, and said only, "Pa would have liked that well." "He would have," Josiah agreed. "I was wrong about the note," Cyrus said, the words coming out stiff, unpracticed, but genuine for all that. "Wrong about a lot of it, maybe. I've had some time to think, watching you these past months." He did not look at his brother as he said it, which Josiah understood, without needing it explained, to be its own kind of honesty. "Doesn't fix 12 years. But I thought you ought to hear it said." "I appreciate you saying it," Josiah said, and did not push further than that, because he had learned enough from watching his own wife's patience with difficult truths to know that some reconciliations needed room to grow slowly, without being forced toward a conclusion before they were ready. Silas Pruitt offered no such reckoning that day, though the bank board's growing awareness of his conduct that winter would, within 2 years, see him quietly eased from the presidency in favor of Whitcomb himself, a consequence proportional and unspectacular, exactly the sort visited on men whose failures are ones of quiet self-interest rather than dramatic crime. Agatha Beadle, for her part, sought Clara out before the afternoon was through, standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the well-digging demonstration until Clara noticed her and waited, without prompting, for whatever the woman had come to say. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Colton," Agatha said. "I spent all winter deciding you were hiding something shameful, and it turns out you were only hiding something the whole county's better off for finding out." "You weren't entirely wrong that I was hiding something, Mrs. Beadle," Clara said, not unkindly. "I'd only ask you remember, next time a stranger arrives in town with an uncertain past, that the truth usually turns out more complicated and less scandalous than the story that fills the silence first." Agatha considered this a long moment, then nodded, something in her expression settling into a grudging, genuine respect that would grow, over the coming years, into an actual friendship neither woman could have predicted that afternoon. "I'll remember it," she said, and meant it. The schoolhouse broke ground that same spring, on a rise of dry, solid ground half a mile from the Colton place, close enough to the new irrigation ditch that Tobias had finished running down from the well by summer that a stand of young cottonwoods could be planted along its western edge, and far enough from the creek itself that no flood, however hard the rains came in future years, would ever threaten it. Clara chose the site herself, walking the ground with the same slow, careful attention she'd once given the willow line, and when Josiah asked her why that particular rise instead of the flatter ground closer to town, she said only that a schoolhouse ought to sit somewhere a child could see the whole valley from its steps, and let that be reason enough. By the time it opened its doors in the autumn of 1877, with a proper teacher hired from Fort Worth and 31 children from 4 different ranch families enrolled for its first term, Clara was 7 months into her first pregnancy, moving through those final weeks of summer with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything else. And Josiah had taken to riding out to the schoolhouse site most evenings after supper, not for any particular reason he could name aloud, except that watching the building rise, board by board, seemed to settle something in him that the note at First Bank, however thoroughly resolved, had never quite managed to touch. Their daughter Edwina, named at Clara's quiet insistence for the father she had lost, was born in October of that year, in the same back bedroom where Clara had once unpacked a trunk with a false bottom in it, with Hannah Merrick and the circuit doctor both present, and Daniel, 8 years old by then and thoroughly unable to sit still, pacing the front room until Josiah finally gave him a chore to do simply to keep him occupied. 2 more children followed in the years after, a son, Edwin, in 1880, and a second daughter, Ruth, in 1883, and the household that had begun as a practical arrangement between 2 near strangers grew, slowly and without any single dramatic turning point Clara could point to afterward, into something she came to think of, quietly and without ever quite saying it aloud to anyone but Hannah, as the truest kind of family she had ever known, considerably more so than the household she'd been raised in. The ranch itself grew alongside the family. The well held steady through the drought of 1881, the worst the county had seen in a generation, worse even than the summer Clara had first arrived, and the Colton place was one of only 3 ranches in the whole valley that lost no cattle to thirst that year, a fact that settled, permanently and without further argument from anyone, the last lingering whispers about whether the woman who'd married in from Georgia had brought the ranch good fortune or simple foolishness dressed up as confidence. Neighboring families began asking Clara, informally at first and then with growing regularity, to walk their own land and mark where a well might be dug, and by the mid-1880s she had developed, without ever intending to build a trade of it, a modest but genuine reputation across 3 counties as a woman who could find water where other people saw only dust. Knowledge she never charged for beyond the cost of her time, because she had decided, early on, that a skill her own father had taught her freely ought to be passed along the same way. Cyrus Colton's reconciliation with his brother came slowly, exactly as it had begun that afternoon at the Founders' Gathering, not through any single dramatic gesture, but through years of small, accumulated decency that neither man ever named directly as forgiveness. He married, in 1878, a widow from the next county over named Louisa Fenn, and the marriage seemed to ease something long knotted in him. He began riding over to the Colton place more often, not to press old grievances, but simply to help with branding or fence work when an extra hand was needed. And by the time Edwin was old enough to sit a horse, Cyrus had become, without either brother ever formally declaring a truce, something close to the uncle the boy had never otherwise had. When the great flood of 1889 washed out the low bridge over Marrow Creek and threatened to take half the Colton hay crop with it, Cyrus was among the first men on the scene with his own wagon and his own hired hands, working alongside Josiah through 2 full days of exhausting labor without either of them once mentioning the note, the gray gelding, or the 12 years of grievance that had once stood between them. It was not, in the end, a full or perfect reconciliation. Some old wounds, Clara had come to understand by then, simply did not close entirely, whatever kindness followed them. But it was genuine, and it held, and when Cyrus died of a lung fever in the winter of 1894, Josiah stood at his grave and wept in a way Clara had seen him do only once before, the day the well first struck water, and she understood both times to be, in their way, the same species of grief. Grief for time that could not be gotten back, mixed with gratitude for what had been salvaged before it ran out entirely. Silas Pruitt left Merrow Creek in 1877, not long after Whitcomb quietly assumed the bank presidency, taking a position at a bank in Fort Worth where his particular talent for finding comfortable arrangements between powerful men went, evidently, considerably further unexamined than it had in a town small enough for its residents to eventually notice a pattern. Clara heard, second-hand and years later, that he had lost that position too, in 1891, over some similar matter involving a rancher's note and a buyer conveniently positioned to benefit from its early call, and she found, turning the news over, that she felt neither satisfaction nor particular surprise, only the quiet, settled certainty of a woman who had recognized a pattern correctly the first time she'd encountered it and had never had cause to doubt her own judgment on the matter since. Agatha Beetle's friendship with Clara deepened over the years into something neither woman could have predicted that first winter, built gradually through shared work on the schoolhouse's parents' committee and eventually through Agatha's own daughter enrolling as one of its earliest and most promising students. By 1885, Agatha had become one of the schoolhouse's most vocal defenders against a brief effort by a newly arrived county commissioner to cut its modest public funding, standing up at a town meeting to declare, with the same carrying voice she'd once used to spread suspicion about a mail-order bride's mysterious past, that Merrow Creek Schoolhouse had done more good for the county in 8 years than any commissioner's office had managed in twice that time, and daring anyone present to argue otherwise. No one did. Daniel grew into a serious, steady young man who inherited, by his own account and everyone else's, considerably more of his stepmother's patient attentiveness than his father's plain-spoken bluntness, though he had plenty of the latter too when it mattered. He rode alongside Clara on her water-finding expeditions from the time he was old enough to hold a stake steady, learning to read soil and seep lines the way she had once learned from her own father. And by the time he was 20, he had begun, with Clara's careful instruction and eventual blessing, to take on some of that work himself, riding out to survey ranches 2 and 3 counties distant that had heard, by then, of the Coltons' reputation for finding water in unlikely ground. He married a schoolteacher named Sarah Prentice in 1889, a woman he had first met, fittingly enough, at the very schoolhouse his stepmother had built, and the two of them eventually took over much of the day-to-day running of the expanded ranch as Josiah's own health began, gradually and without any single dramatic decline, to slow him down through the 1890s. The schoolhouse itself grew considerably beyond its first modest term. By 1890, it had expanded to include a small library, the first in the county, stocked initially with books Clara ordered from Fort Worth and Santa Fe, using a portion of the continuing New Mexico royalties, and later supplemented by donations from families across 3 counties, who had, over the years, come to think of the Merrow Creek Schoolhouse as something closer to a shared inheritance than a single family's charitable project. Edwina, Clara's eldest daughter, took over as its head teacher in 1896 at the age of 19, having trained for 2 years in Austin specifically for the purpose, and brought to the position the same unhurried, exacting patience her mother had once brought to a household ledger and 160 acres of New Mexico scrubland, a patience the schoolhouse's youngest students, filing in each autumn morning uncertain of their letters, came to know well and, eventually, to trust the way an earlier generation of Merrow Creek had learned, slowly and against its own initial suspicions, to trust Clara herself. By the autumn of 1898, 24 years after a stagecoach had first pulled up outside the Merrow Creek Mercantile, carrying a woman with a false-bottomed trunk and a notebook full of her dead father's careful private shorthand, Clara Colton was 46 years old. her dark hair gone gray at the temples, in a way she had stopped bothering to disguise years before, and she still rose most mornings before the rest of the household, though these days it was less out of necessity than out of a habit too deeply worn to abandon. Josiah, 61, and slowed by a winter chest ailment that had settled into his lungs 2 years prior and never fully cleared, no longer rode the fence lines himself, leaving that work to Daniel and to the 2 hired men the expanded ranch now employed. But he still walked out most mornings to the well. The same well, still producing steady, sweet water a quarter-century after Tobias Reyes had first shored its walls with green cottonwood planking, and stood at its rim a while before breakfast, in a private ritual Clara had long since stopped asking him to explain. Tobias himself had stayed on the Colton Ranch the whole of those 24 years, never marrying, never fully explaining the old wound in his leg, or the years before he'd arrived leading a lame horse on foot, but becoming, in his quiet, unhurried way, as permanent and as trusted a fixture of the household as any blood relation. The man Daniel had learned tracking and fence mending from, the man Edwin, Clara's second child, now a broad-shouldered 18-year-old with his father's plain bluntness and his mother's patient attention to ground, still called upon whenever a new well needed staking or a lost calf needed finding in rough country. He had grown old there, too, gray-bearded and slower on his feet than he'd once been, but as sharp-eyed as ever, and it was Tobias, more than anyone else left living who remembered it, who told the story of the first test holes at the creek bend to Clara's grandchildren, embellishing it only slightly with each retelling, until the youngest of them had come to believe, not entirely inaccurately, that their grandmother had once dug a well with nothing but her own 2 hands and an old book full of secrets. Daniel and Sarah had 3 children of their own by 1898, the eldest a serious, watchful girl of 8 named Clara Louise after her grandmother, who had already begun following her own grandmother on short walks along the creek bed, asking the same patient, relentless questions about clay color and willow roots that Daniel himself had once asked 22 years before, on a morning when the whole valley still lay gripped in drought and nobody yet knew what the new bride from Georgia actually carried in that trunk of hers. Clara found, watching her granddaughter crouch at the water's edge one October afternoon and press her small palm flat against the damp bank, the exact way she herself had done on her 4th morning at Marrow Creek all those years before, that the years folded together in a way that felt less like the passage of time than like the same lesson being taught again, patiently, to whoever was ready to receive it next. "Grandmother," the girl asked that afternoon, "how did you know the willows meant water, the very first time you saw them?" "I didn't know it the first time," Clara said, settling herself on a flat rock beside the bank, her joints stiffer these days than they'd once been, but her attention no less careful for it. "I only suspected it, because my own father taught me that water is patient. It doesn't announce itself the way a river does, all noise and motion. It waits under the ground, quiet, for someone willing to look closely enough to notice where it's been. Your Uncle Daniel taught me that lesson back to myself once, without either of us quite realizing it, the day he brought me a fistful of damp earth from this very bend and asked if it meant the willows were right." She smoothed a strand of gray hair back from her face, watching the creek run steady and full past the old test hole markers, long since worn to nothing but faint depressions in the bank. "Most things worth finding are like that. They don't shout. You have to be willing to sit still and pay attention, longer than most people care to, before they show themselves." The schoolhouse, by 1898, had grown into the largest institution of its kind for 3 counties in any direction. Its library shelves, expanded twice since Edwina had taken over as head teacher 2 years before, holding better than 1,100 volumes, its enrollment having long since outgrown the original single room into a proper 2-story building, funded partly by continuing royalties from the New Mexico lease. which had, in the 2.5 decades since Clara first negotiated it, produced a steady and honorable fortune considerably beyond anything Emmett Vance had ever imagined trying to claim, and considerably beyond, too, anything Clara herself had expected when she first sewed a folded deed into the lining of a trunk in her uncle's Millhaven house, hoping only that it might someday buy her a measure of safety nobody could take from her. Edwina had married a rancher's son from the next valley over in 1897, but had insisted, with a firmness her mother recognized instantly and with no small pride, on continuing as head teacher rather than retiring to run a household exclusively, a choice that would have scandalized Marrow Creek sewing circles 20 years earlier, and now drew from most quarters only the mild, unbothered acceptance of a town that had long since learned to expect unusual competence from Colton women. Edwin, the middle child, proved the least interested of the three in either surveying or teaching, and Clara had made her peace with that early, having decided, watching him as a boy, far more taken with the mechanics of the well pump and the irrigation gates than with soil color or seep lines, that a mother who had spent her own youth being underestimated for what she knew owed her children the same freedom to be good at something entirely their own. He took to the practical running of the ranch itself with a steady, unglamorous competence that suited him, expanding the herd through the 1890s until the Colton spread had grown to nearly 800 acres, and it was Edwin, more than either of his sisters, who quietly kept the whole enterprise solvent through 2 further lean years in the following decade, applying to cattle and fence lines the same patient, unhurried attention his mother had once applied to willow roots and gray clay. He married a rancher's daughter from the Merrick side of the valley in 1902, Hannah's own granddaughter as it happened, a connection that delighted both older women considerably more than either let on at the time, though each pretended for months to be entirely surprised by it. And it was his branch of the family that continued working the original home section long after Daniel and Ruth had each carried the Whitfield name's particular gifts out into wider country. Ruth, the youngest, had taken a different path entirely, apprenticing herself at 17 to a Fort Worth surveying firm that had, somewhat to everyone's amusement, specifically sought her out after hearing of her mother's reputation, and writing home most months with detailed, enthusiastic letters about railroad surveys running through country Clara herself had never seen, though she recognized, reading them, the same careful attention to strata and seep lines and soil color that her own father had once taught her on dusty Georgia survey trails, passed down now 3 generations deep through people who had never once met the man who'd started it. Rufus Whitfield, Clara's uncle, had written to her exactly once in all those 24 years, in 1882, a stiff, carefully worded letter that arrived without warning and offered something that might have been intended as an apology, though it never used the word directly, referencing only regrettable haste in the handling of her father's estate and expressing a hope that she had found suitable circumstances out west. Clara had read it twice, felt considerably less about it than she might once have expected to feel, and written back a single measured paragraph confirming that she had indeed found suitable circumstances, considerably more suitable, in fact, than anything her uncle's handling of the estate had left her reason to expect, and that she wished him well without any particular need to hear from him again. She never did. He died in 1891, according to a brief notice a Millhaven cousin thought to send her, and Clara marked the news with a quiet, unhurried moment of reflection rather than grief, and then returned to whatever work the day had already set before her, because she had long since decided that a life well built required considerably more attention than a life merely avenged, and she preferred, on the whole, to spend her remaining years on the former. Emmett Vance she never heard from again after that March afternoon at the Founders' Gathering, though a Charleston acquaintance of Hannah's mentioned, years later and entirely in passing, that he had married poorly, lost considerably more than he'd ever gained chasing other men's fortunes, and ended up, by the mid-1890s, a minor and largely forgotten figure in a city that had once considered him promising. Clara received the news with the same measured indifference she'd given her uncle's death, understanding by then that the truest measure of her own life's success had never actually depended on the failures or reckonings of the people who had once tried to diminish it, and that she had, somewhere in the 2.5 decades since a stagecoach first set her down in a town she'd never seen, stopped needing their downfall to feel the fullness of her own. Josiah's health worsened through the following winter, the chest ailment settling deeper than the county doctor's remedies could reach, and he died in February of 1899, quietly, in the same back bedroom where all 3 of their children had been born, with Clara's hand in his, and Daniel and Edwina and Ruth all gathered close. And his last clear words, spoken to Clara alone in the gray hour before dawn, were not about the ranch or the note long since paid, or any of the trouble that had once stood between them, but a simple, unadorned thing he had apparently been turning over for some time, and had decided, at the end, needed saying plainly, "Best decision I ever made, writing that agency." Clara lived on at Marrow Creek another 11 years, watching the ranch pass gradually into Daniel and Sarah's steady hands, watching Clara Louise grow into a young woman with her own quiet, careful competence, watching the schoolhouse become, under Edwina's continued guidance, the kind of institution families from 4 counties away sent their children to board for, if they could manage it. She died in the spring of 1910, at 57, in the same house she had first unpacked a trunk in 36 years before, and was buried beside Josiah on the rise above the schoolhouse, where the 2 of them could look out, as Clara had once told Josiah a schoolhouse ought to let a child look out, over the whole valley, the well that still ran steady, the irrigation ditch grown thick with old cottonwoods, the schoolhouse itself with its 2 stories and its 1,100 books, and the creek bed where a willow line had once told a patient, watchful young bride that water, like most things worth finding, did not announce itself, but waited quietly to be noticed by whoever cared enough to look. Hannah Merrick outlived Clara by only 2 years, dying in 1912 at 74, having never remarried, having run her own 300 acres with the same unbending stubbornness for the whole of her long widowhood, and having stood, in the end, as close a friend to Clara Colton as either woman had ever allowed herself outside her own family. The 2 of them had shelled beans together at that same kitchen table more Sundays than either could have counted, over 4 decades, trading news and opinions, and in later years, grandchildren's accomplishments, with the same unhurried directness that had marked their very first conversation. It was Hannah's daughter, Prudence, who eventually took over the Merrick spread, and it was Prudence's own children who would grow up thinking of the Colton schoolhouse not as anyone's charitable project, but simply as a fixed and permanent feature of the valley, the way a hill or a creek bed might be, having never known a Marrow Creek without it. Tobias Reyes stayed on the ranch until his own death in 1908, at an age nobody, including Tobias himself, had ever managed to pin down with certainty, working right up until his final winter, despite a body grown stiff and slow with the accumulated wear of a lifetime spent outdoors. He never did explain the old wound in his leg to anyone's full satisfaction, though Daniel, going through the old man's few possessions after his death, found a faded photograph of a woman and a child neither he nor anyone else in Marrow Creek could identify, tucked carefully inside a Bible Tobias had never once been seen reading, and understood, without needing further explanation, that the quiet drifter who'd arrived on foot, leading a lame horse 34 years before, had carried some private grief of his own the whole while, one he'd chosen, in the end, to spend among people who'd never pressed him for it, and who had, in their own unhurried way, become the closest thing to a family he'd allowed himself since whatever loss the photograph represented. He was buried, at his own quiet request made to Daniel some years before his death, at the edge of the creek bend where the first test hole had struck water in 1875. Under a plain marker Daniel carved himself, reading only, Tobias Reyes. He knew how to look. The schoolhouse continued to grow long after both Clara and Edwina had passed from its daily oversight, Edwina serving as head teacher until 1921, and training, in her turn, a whole second generation of Marrow Creek teachers before handing the position to one of her own former students. By 1930, it had become the anchor of what had grown into a proper small town rather than a scattering of ranches, its library holding better than 3,000 volumes, its two-story building long since expanded to 4 rooms and a proper assembly hall, and a bronze plaque mounted beside its front doors, placed there by the County Historical Society in 1925 on the 50th anniversary of its founding, reading simply, "Founded 1877, by Clara Whitfield Colton, who believed a valley ought to have something worth growing toward." The plaque made no mention of silver mines or banknotes or the particular chain of family betrayals and hard-won trust that had actually produced it, because by 1925, those details had passed, as most private histories eventually do, into the softer, simplified shape of local legend, a woman who'd arrived with nothing and built something lasting. The specifics of the trunk and the notebook and the false bottom worn smooth into a single, general understanding that Marrow Creek Schoolhouse had begun with a woman who'd seen more than anyone expected her to. Visiting county officials in later decades sometimes asked the schoolhouse's staff for the fuller story behind the plaque's plain wording, and were generally given, in reply, only the same unhurried, economical version Clara herself had always preferred to any embellished retelling. A woman had come west expecting little, had paid close attention to ground and people alike, and had built, slowly and without asking anyone's permission to be more capable than they'd assumed, something the whole valley continued to draw on long after her own hands were no longer the ones doing the drawing. But the family itself never entirely lost the specifics. Clara's own notebook, her father's original field notes, the private shorthand the two of them had once shared on Georgia survey trails, was never sold, never given away, never even displayed in the schoolhouse's small local history case, though the deed itself, the original document Emmett Vance had once tried to leverage against her, eventually was, framed behind glass, a plain, unremarkable-looking legal paper that visitors to the schoolhouse's history room often walked past without a second glance, never quite understanding that the entire town around them owed its existence, in some considerable part, to the $80 Edwin Whitfield had spent on scrubland 11 months before he died, and the daughter who had known better than to let anyone talk her out of what it was actually worth. The notebook itself passed down instead through the family's practicing surveyors, from Clara to Daniel, who used it and added his own notes to its later pages through decades of well-sighting work across 4 counties. From Daniel, eventually, to Ruth, who carried it with her through her own long career with the Fort Worth surveying firm and the railroad lines that gradually spread west through the early years of the new century. And finally to Clara Louise, Daniel's eldest daughter, who had once crouched at a creek bend as a girl of 8 and pressed her palm flat against damp clay the way her grandmother had taught her, and who kept the notebook, in her turn, in a cedar box at the foot of her own bed, understanding it not as an heirloom to be preserved behind glass, but as a living tool still worth using, exactly as her grandmother had always insisted it should be. Clara Louise would tell her own grandchildren, decades later, in the 1960s, sitting on the porch of a house not far from the original Colton place, a story that had by then passed through 4 generations of retelling but had lost, somehow, none of its essential shape, about a woman who had arrived on a stagecoach believing herself sent away to disappear, carrying a secret sewn into the lining of a trunk, who had spent months watching quietly before she ever said what she knew, and who had built, out of patience and hard-won trust, and a stubborn refusal to let any man's greed decide what she was worth, not just a well and a ranch and a fortune, but an entire town's understanding of what a woman arriving with nothing visible might actually be carrying inside her, if anyone cared enough to look closely and wait long enough to see it. Grandmother Clara used to say water was patient, Clara Louise would tell them, in that porch light retelling, echoing words she'd heard directly from the source herself, all those decades before, at a creek bend worn smooth by generations of children crouching at its bank to press their palms against the damp clay and ask what it meant. It doesn't shout, it waits underground, quiet, for somebody willing to look closely enough to notice where it's been. I think she meant it about more than water. In the end, I think she meant it about herself, too, and about anybody who's ever been underestimated by people too impatient or too careless to look past the surface of things. And on quiet mornings still, long after every person who had actually lived the story had passed from Marrow Creek into whatever remained of memory, the well at the creek bend continued running clear and steady beneath the same stand of willows Clara Whitfield had once studied on her fourth morning in a strange new land, the water beneath them exactly as patient as it had always been, and exactly as ready, for anyone who cared to kneel down and look, to be found. The willows along the creek bend had grown thick and tall by then, decades of steady water at their roots turning what had once been a bare, hexagon-cracked stretch of drought-starved clay into a deep green corridor of shade that ran the whole length of the Colton land, shading, over the years, 3 generations of children who crouched at that same bank the way a young bride once had, pressing small palms flat against damp earth to see for themselves what patience left buried long enough might finally become. And on still mornings, long after every voice in this story had finally gone quiet, the water beneath the willows kept doing exactly what it had always done, season after season, decade after decade, waiting, patient and unhurried, for whoever next knelt down at the bank and thought to look closely enough to notice where it had been all along.